Are you overwhelmed by these long vocab lists? You find yourself struggling to remember them even after multiple attempts. In this video, I'm going to share two fundamental principles that completely transformed my vocabulary learning, along with some practical tips that work hand in hand with these principles. With these tips, I pick up words naturally, just like how native speakers do. So, let's find out. Let's start with the most effective way of learning new words, and that is making words make sense to you. You have probably heard something called context-based learning, and the core idea is simple. To remember something deeply and permanently, we need to learn something that makes sense to us. And you're probably familiar with this diagram. It is called Ebbinghaus curve of retention. It shows that we forget new information quickly, often within days. This has somehow become the Bible in the language learning community. Many teachers and language learners use this curve to justify even forcing constant review and frequent flashcard drilling. But here's another side of the story. Ebbinghaus tested memory using completely nonsensical symbols that had no associations at all. He did this to study pure memory without any logical connections. So for information that makes no sense to us, yes, we forget it quickly because these items stay in our brain as isolated units with no connection to our existing knowledge. But what happens when the material we're learning actually makes sense? In the early 1900s, there was an English teacher named Philip Ballard, and he conducted an experiment. He asked his students to memorize verses from a poem by Wordsworth, something with rhyme, rhythm, and narrative structure for, of course, native English speakers. The students did well on the first test immediately after they had studied and remembered this poem. Then Ballard tested his students again a few days later, without warning them about the test. But the result was stunning. Instead of forgetting the verses like the Ebbinghaus curve would predict, the students' memory had actually improved without any additional study, which was remarkable. This shows us something crucial. When English words are connected to meaningful context and relate to our lives, we remember them more clearly and don't need day-to-day reviewing. Now, to help learners make vocabulary meaningful, people have developed various methods. I categorize them into four main approaches. First, the story-making method, creating stories using letters and syllables of a vocabulary. Second, the homophonic method, using sound similarity and transliteration into our native language. Third, the etymological method, understanding word origins and structure. And fourth, image-based method, connecting words to visual images or actual objects in our life. And after extensive testing, I found that etymological and image-based methods work best for me. At least for me, and here's how I do it. Okay, when I encounter unfamiliar vocabulary, especially longer and complex words, I look up its meaning, but I also use an etymological dictionary to understand how the word is constructed. By knowing its prefix, root, and suffix, I can often decode a word's meaning. This method is particularly powerful because many advanced words, especially academic and technical vocab, come from Latin and Greek roots that follow predictable patterns. Instead of seeing a long word as a meaningless string of letters like Ebbinghaus nonsensical syllables, we can break it down into meaningful components. To master this approach, I highly recommend two books, Word Power Made Easy and Merriam-Webster's Vocabulary Builder. These will teach you the most common vocabulary building elements in English. It takes quite a long time to learn these prefix, roots, and suffix, but they have benefited my word learning along the way, like once and for all. If you also need these two books, I put links in the description and you can check that out. The second method involves connecting new words to my personal experience and environment. Modern dictionaries often include images alongside definitions of a word, and research consistently shows that our brains remember visual information better than text alone. But simply looking at dictionary pictures isn't enough. The key is to actively connect new vocabulary to things I encounter in my daily life. For example, when I'm walking down the street and I see something interesting, I try to think of the English concept of it. If I don't know it, I look it up. So I immediately create the connection between the word and my real experience. This transforms me from a passive learner who just receives information into an active learner, actively seeking and creating connections in my mind. This also explains why many people struggle with traditional tests. They often involve vocabulary that has no connection to the students' lives or interests. So, without personal relevance, we lose our natural motivation to learn and remember. However, making words meaningful is just the first step. Even when vocabulary makes sense to us, we still need to encounter it regularly to maintain easy access to it. So that comes the second principle. Principle number two, natural repetition through multiple exposure. Our brains operate on a use it or lose it principle. If we don't actively recall image, even meaningful image, we gradually lose that access. Think of your brain like a well-organized warehouse. When you make a word meaningful, you're actually essentially putting it into a clearly labeled box in the right section. But even in the most organized warehouse, if you don't use a tool for months, you might forget exactly which box you put it in. So this brings me to what I call natural repetition, which is slightly different from what you may know as spaced repetition. Spaced repetition typically involves reviewing vocab with flashcards at predetermined intervals, once a day, then every few days, then weekly, and so on. While this can work for test preparation, it has limitations for long-term natural vocabulary acquisition. Most importantly, native speakers don't learn vocabulary this way. The same word would appear in different contexts with different nuances, serving different purposes. Here's what happens when I read extensively in English and encounter a word that I don't know, then I look it up using context and word roots to make it meaningful. A little bit later, or even a few days later, while reading the same book with another text, I see the word, but if I forget it, I look it up again. The third time I encounter it, something magical happens. I instantly recognize and understand the word. Here's the good news. Each encounter likely happens in a different context, showing me different aspects of how the word functions. This creates multiple pathways to the same word in my memory, like having several different ways of locating a word in a warehouse. Now you may see it. This approach represents casual, sustainable learning rather than bespoke learning, intensively cramming materials aggressively for short periods, like something before exams, which often leads to burnout and forgetting most materials shortly after the test. Natural repetition, by contrast, requires just a short duration of reading or listening daily. It is relaxed, enjoyable, and sustainable over long periods. I don't need to force myself. I am simply just engaging with English content that I find interesting. Okay, for the natural repetition method to work effectively, we need to choose materials where we understand approximately 80% of the vocab. This means that you will encounter some new words, but not so many that you are constantly stopping and checking things out. To find materials at your level, take an English proficiency test or a vocab test to determine whether you are at A1, A2, or something like that. Then choose books, articles, and podcasts specifically recommended for that level. I have more tips about that in this video, so you can check that out. So these are the two principles that can form a foundation of effective vocabulary learning. And here are some bonus tips that will enhance this process. Tip number one, let listening help you. Listening is crucial for English vocabulary acquisition, especially for me whose native languages have different sound systems. For example, looking at a word technological on paper, it appears as a long string of letters, but when you hear it pronounced multiple times, you begin to understand how the syllables flow together, how the stress patterns work. Regular listening helps you internalize the sound patterns of English, and if you listen to English a lot, I think phonetics will come natural to you. Tip number two, create your own flashcards. Instead of trying to learn thousands of random words from lots of apps, organize vocabulary into smaller, manageable groups of like 50 to 100 words that relate to specific topics or contexts is way more helpful. Or you can create a study set that is related to your major or recent events. I like to use Quizlet to collect the words that I recently remembered, where I just activate a dedicated folder in my Memo app, and I find it very effective. Tip number three, learn phrases, not isolated words. This is perhaps the most important tip. Always learn vocabulary within phrases or shortened sentences, never as isolated words. Actually, I never used a word list like this. Rather, I use a phrase list like this. This helps me better recognize the usage of a certain vocab. And again, like I said before, with multiple exposure to the same word in different phrases, I would certainly know more ways to use a certain word. So that's all for the sharing. These are by far the most effective way for me to learn vocab. You might tell the difference in this video. I repetitively say to learn a vocab instead of to memorize vocab. This is because the goal isn't to memorize as many words as possible and as quickly as possible, but to build a deep, flexible understanding of vocab that you can actually use in real communication. Instead of cramming a lot of words, I just pick up words naturally, a little bit, day by day, and that's an effective learning. So yeah, that's what I do to learn new words. Hope you find it helpful, and I'm Shawny English here. Remember, happy learning, and I will see you next video.